This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
I will tell you that our system is broken. I give to many people. Before 2 months ago, I was a businessman. I give to everybody. When they call, I give. And you know what? When I need something from them 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them. They are there for me.
Donald Trump said many offensive things last week in the Republican presidential debate. He also said some things rarely heard in such a forum.
On 4 occasions, I've taken advantage of the laws of this country, like other people. I'm not going to name their names because I'm not going to embarrass, but virtually every person that you read about on the front page of the business sections, they've used the law.
Today we'll speak to political scientist Peter Mathews about money and politics.
And he came and admitted that I buy politicians. I give them money, and both parties, and then a few years later when I call them, they're there for me to do me favors.
Peter Mathews is the author of the book Dollar Democracy, With Liberty and Justice for Some, How to Reclaim the American Dream for All. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Cameron Jones. A new round of rallies was planned in and around Ferguson, Missouri today, hours after a man was critically wounded in a gun battle with police. The violence follows peaceful protests to mark the fatal shooting 1 year ago of unarmed black teenager Michael Brown by a white police officer. On Sunday night in the St. Louis suburbs, several volleys of gunshots rang out as police in riot gear tried to disperse demonstrators, blocking traffic and smashing storefront windows. Interim Ferguson Police Chief Andre Anderson says authorities are trying to walk a fine line with the crowd.
We've allowed people to protest, but we've also allowed for people to disseminate. We've given them plenty of egress so that they can leave. We've given over 15 orders to disperse, and we've been very patient. But at some point, some of these folks are going to have to get off the roadway.
Separately, 2 teenage males were shot early today in a drive-by attack near a sidewalk shrine erected in Brown's memory, but police say their wounds were not considered life-threatening. The violence was in marked contrast to a day of mostly subdued, peaceful commemorations in Ferguson and elsewhere. The United States consulate in Istanbul came under gunfire today, and at least 8 people were killed in a wave of separate attacks on Turkish security forces. The violence comes weeks after Ankara launched a crackdown on militants from the self-described Islamic State in Syria and fighters with the PKK Kurdistan Workers' Party in northern Iraq. 6 U.S. F-16 fighter jets arrived at an air base in southern Turkey yesterday to join the U.S.-led coalition fight against IS militants. The U.S. military says the Air Force deployed a detachment of 6 F-16 jets, support equipment, and about 300 personnel at Incirlik Air Base. Vermont Senator and Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders last night spoke to his second packed crowd in the Pacific Northwest as around 28,000 supporters filled Portland's Moda Center, the biggest crowd yet in the 2016 presidential campaign. Sanders spoke for about an hour and touched on things like sustainable energy, the need for affordable higher education, and the environment. But much of his speech centered on economic issues, including income inequality.
In my view, the issue of wealth and income inequality is the great moral issue of our time, and we are going to inject the issue of morality into politics today.
On Saturday, Sanders spoke to a packed audience at the University of Washington campus, but earlier in the day in Seattle, Sanders was shoved aside by Black Lives Matter activists who called for changes to the criminal justice system. Sanders heads to events in California today. Donald Trump said today he never intended to say anything inappropriate about Fox News moderator Megyn Kelly, and said the uproar over his criticism is all fueled by the press. During last week's Republican presidential debate, Trump was angered by Kelly's line of questioning over Trump's past statements on women. Trump later seemed to tell CNN that Kelly's line of questioning was due to her menstrual cycle. Trump, who denied he made the insinuation, has been digging in his heels since last Thursday's debate and has refused to apologize. In a telephone interview on MSNBC's Morning Joe show today, Trump said Kelly owes him an apology for her attack on him during the debate.
The fact is, she asked me a very inappropriate question. She should really be apologizing to me. You want to know the truth.
Trump, a real estate developer and former reality TV star, has so far not participated in any substantive discussion of public policy. Some 3 million gallons of toxic wastewater, triple previous estimates, have poured from an abandoned Colorado gold mine into local streams since a team of Environmental Protective Agency workers accidentally triggered the spill last week. EPA officials say the discharge at the Gold King mine contains high concentrations of heavy metals such as arsenic, mercury, and lead. Sean McGrath is an EPA administrator.
It continues to discharge, and it's at the volume of about 500 gallons per minute. That discharge is going into a settlement pond, 2 settlement ponds that we created over the last couple of days.
EPA officials say downstream residents have reported water discoloration. The agency hasn't confirmed if the contamination poses a threat to health. I'm Cameron Jones. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. It's hard to argue that Donald Trump wasn't as offensive as he possibly could be at last week's presidential Republican debate. His comments about Rosie McDonald and responses to questions about his past remarks on women were as though they came from another era. And his responses to the controversy that he started last week in interviews since have been just as offensive. But there was one thing that Donald Trump did say in that debate that I thought, in my short time covering presidential elections, that was as honest of a response to a question that I can ever remember hearing.
You've also donated to several Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton included, Nancy Pelosi. You explained away those donations, saying you did that to get business-related favors. And you said recently, quote, when you give, they do whatever the hell you want them to do.
You better believe it.
So what specifically did they do?
If I ask them, if I need them, most of the people on this stage I've given to, just so you understand. A lot of money.
Not me.
Not me. But you're welcome to give me a check, Donald, if you'd like.
Many of them.
Actually, to be clear,
he
supported Charlie Crist.
Not much.
Hey, Charlie,
but I have...
Donald, if you end your campaign, I hope you will give to me.
Good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Sounds good to me, Governor. I will tell you that our system is broken. I give to many people. Before 2 months ago, I was a businessman. I give to everybody. When they call, I give. And you know what? When I need something from them 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them. They are there for me.
So
and that's a broken system.
So what'd you get from Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi?
Well, I'll tell you what. With Hillary Clinton, I said, be at my wedding, and she came to my wedding. You know why? She had no choice because I gave. I gave to a foundation that, frankly, that foundation is supposed to do good. I didn't know her money would be used on private jets going all over the world. It was.
And that was Donald Trump at last week's Republican presidential debate hosted by Fox, responding to a question about his political contributions. Well, for more on all this, I'm joined by Peter Mathews. Peter Mathews is a professor of political science at Cypress College and adjunct professor of sociology at Long Beach City College. He provides political analysis and guest hosts at several radio stations, including our very own sister station, KPFK, in Los Angeles. He's the author of the book, Dollar Democracy with Liberty and Justice for Some, How to Reclaim the American Dream for All. Peter Mathews, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you to this radio station.
It's great to be here, Mitch, and thank you for having me.
I don't want to gloss over the comments that he said about women and what he has said since.
Yes.
It's gotten a lot of attention. What I also found incredibly remarkable, though, in that debate is when he talked about how he gives to all candidates, regardless of party, and then they're there for him when he needs them.
Wasn't that remarkable, Mitch? In fact, I would say it's straight from the horse's mouth. He's a political actor. He ran for Congress several times, president several times, and he came and admitted that I buy politicians. I give them money, and both parties, and then a few years later when I called them, they're there for me to do me favors.
I almost was, I remember, what was the term for Franklin D. Roosevelt? Traitor to his class.
Yes.
For a moment, I was thinking about that with Donald Trump. He was lifting the lid on this very sensitive issue.
True. That's a good point. It sounds like that he could be considered that, too, to some extent. But I think he's doing it to get publicity, which he wants to have in order to win this sort of a presidential primary.
And I imagine he, unlike the other Republican contenders and Democratic contenders as well, maybe less so Bernie Sanders, who seems to be taking more of an ethical approach in fundraising. He refuses to create a super PAC in these things. But I would imagine Donald Trump is not so beholden to any other money interest out there because he has so much of his own money.
Yes, that's an interesting point. He has his own money. He can spend it all, or most of it, for getting elected. But, he represents a class of people. It's a real estate investment capital. It has to do, I'm sure he's got stock market holdings. He must have some, and that's globalization, isn't it? So his class position as an investor, as a big corporate businessman, is going to have him beholden to people who will be his buddies and friends, some of whom he gave money to and some who will give money to him in other ways, maybe taking him out on vacation to Hawaii to discuss the issues like they do with politicians. So I don't see that as a really legitimate argument that he won't be beholden to big money, because I would say he is big money.
Similar to Ross Perot in the 1990s?
A little different, because Ross Perot hit the economic issue hard. He said there needs to be a tax increase, and progressive tax increase, to pay down the debt. He was specific. Now, Donald Trump, I'm not sure he's been that specific yet. Perhaps he could get there. We don't know. We'll have to find out. It's still early, isn't it?
Now, again, his comments about, and I thought it was pretty hilarious and probably made many of the other candidates uncomfortable when he said, "I've given to everyone" on this panel right here.
He did say that.
And then Marco Rubio said, "Well, no, you didn't give to me." But a few of them said, "No, you didn't give to me."
A couple of them said, "You didn't give to me yet, but please give me some."
Right.
Remember that?
Yep.
The shamelessness about money and dollar democracy.
Not unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the norm.
It is, isn't it, Mitch? It really is, and that's the tragedy today. Money and power are connected. Wealth and power are connected. We know that from political economy and conflict theory and sociology. And so if it's connected on a personal level, of course it's going to be connected on a social and a political level. Those with the biggest money, and Mitch, this is staggering, the top 400 families, actually 400 American families today have given half the money to all the presidential campaigns as of now. And it's still early. 400 have given half the money. Because of that, with that kind of control of money in politics, we have the top 1% in America owning and controlling 50% of the wealth. And, in fact, the top 1% captured 93% of the income that was generated since the Great Recession. That's Dr. Richard Wolff's figures. And there's so many more to corroborate that. So this gap between rich and poor is just growing and growing because these politicians are bought and they give their friends corporate tax loopholes, and the money goes out of the Treasury and not for social programs that would empower the middle class and the poor.
And you give to you. I mean, that's the rule. You give if you have that much money, you give to everyone that you can, because then when you need them, as Donald Trump said, they'll be there.
They'll be there for you.
For you.
Yes. And much more than just going to your wedding like Hillary did. This is much more. He gets a lot more favors that are more than wedding visits.
Yeah, I was wondering where he was coming from that, if he was sort of at that point trying to get out of where he was going.
I think he was trying to make it lighthearted. I'd like to have had the moderator asking, well, what did you get from the other people that you gave money to?
Right.
They didn't all go to your wedding.
Right.
Did you get corporate loopholes? Did you get some investment tax credits? Mr. Trump, what do you think about the rich and poor gap? That's what he should have done. Of course, this is Fox News. What do you expect?
I was looking at a chart you have in your book, Peter Mathews, again, called Dollar Democracy with Liberty and Justice for Some, How to Reclaim the American Dream for All. And you had the top contributors for some of the congressional leaders, including Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Majority Leader, Republican Majority Leader, and then Harry Reid, who is the Democratic Minority Leader in the Senate. And their top 20 contributors, there's about 3 on here that are the same for both of these guys. Comcast and Goldman Sachs immediately come to mind.
And that's the point. These corporate elites give to both sides of the aisle because they know that someone's going to get elected out of the two, and they want to have the benefit to them, and not to the working American people. And so the numbers are staggering. I mean, I'm looking at how health care has been completely devastated because Obamacare was not the answer. It made a few good advances, but it's not even close to the answer. We should have a single-payer universal health care system such as Canada and other countries. And, of course, President Obama didn't want to even bring that to the table because the health insurance industry has bought the system and bought the members of Congress. In education, we used to have tuition-free education, Mitch, as you know, in California in the 60s through the 80s. Tuition-free. When I started teaching at Foothill College here in Northern California in 1976, my students paid $6 for all 15 units. It was a service fee. There was no tuition, just as Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger paid at Santa Monica College. Governor Pete Wilson paid $37 service fee or application fee at UC Berkeley Law School, Mitch. He became an attorney, a businessman, a senator, and a governor. That was the American dream for him. And now today my students can barely make it, Mitch. They're working middle class and working poor that come to my college. And many can't even take a full load of classes because they cannot afford the $46 a unit. Even if they get a BOG waiver, they've got to have living expenses, so many of them only take one class or two instead of taking 5 classes for a full load. It sets them back. The nursing program is impacted. Students have to wait 2 or 3 years to even get in the nursing program when we need nurses in the United States, and yet we're importing nurses, lower-paid nurses from other countries. Globalization is terrible. And not to mention the Wall Street gap crash, which was brought on by this tax cuts on the rich, lack of demand in the economy, and all the shenanigans going on with the exotic instruments that these Wall Street barons pushed through with Glass-Steagall being repealed. Why was Glass-Steagall repealed by Bill Clinton? Because he was a Wall Street candidate. President Obama, why did he reappoint people like Geithner? Unbelievable. Geithner and Larry Summers, who were the ones who helped crash the system. Obama brings them back saying, well, they know how it works, so maybe they can fix it with me. No, they didn't fix it with him. He did not re-regulate. He did not bring in Glass-Steagall back. It's just a corporate government, including a Wall Street government even today, even though I've actually campaigned for him, I hate to admit. But in a sense, I had to back in 2008 when we all thought he would maybe be more progressive, certainly more than John McCain.
Do you think here in his final year and a half, some people call it his final lap, we're seeing a different president?
We are to some extent. To some extent, yes.
Some reforms to criminal justice,
yes.
Environment, immigration. Huh?
Yes, we are to some extent, and he wants to leave an impact in the way that he thinks will be safe and still helpful, and I have to commend him for that. But the fundamental problem is...
Do you think he's freed himself from the interests that helped him get to where...
I think he has, because he has no more elections to run. To some extent, he's free of them, and he wants to leave a legacy. But I do believe the fundamental issue of the middle class, of the gap between rich and poor, of an extreme capitalist system like ours that has deregulated the economy so much after Reaganomics, as my book points out, that is the main crisis. And as the Chinese character for crisis says, it's danger and opportunity. The danger is this country continuing to become an imperial power, not a republic anymore, going around the world, controlling, having 1,000 military bases around the world, as my book points out, which costs us $250 billion to finance every year. This country's overextension of imperial reach is going to crash the system completely. It's already starting to. And that's the danger, the crisis. The opportunity is that people like you and me, Mitch, or at least I'm certainly a lot of other people, are getting together to fight the system and say, look, we've got to have justice and fairness and bring back opportunity and help people develop their full human potential.
Now, I do want to get back to education that you talked about, and you have a chart on funding from for-profit education businesses. Yes. And you have a chart that shows the top 20 recipients of campaign contributions from the for-profit education system. And out of the 20, 11 were Democrats, 9 were Republicans.
Again, they're buying both parties to say, look, the public system is not working. After starving it, after cutting funding, these private robber barons can say, like Apollo Group that owns, I believe, University of Phoenix and others, they can say, you know what, we're giving opportunity for working people who can't go to school full time. And the system in the private system is very strained, so we're helping out. And yet they get these billions of dollars in federal aid for those students, many of whom are promised the world and will never see it, and they're struggling with debt. My friend Brett in Los Angeles, he was bamboozled by this private school to go back and get his degree in technology, in electronic technology, and the federal government actually supported that and said, we'll give you a loan. So now he's so much in debt, that school went out of business. Mitch? He can't get his degree, couldn't take the courses that he needed, and he's so much in student debt. So that's outrageous, and these private schools are to blame for it.
And you were mentioning how your students are financially struggling. You're not at a private school or a for-profit school.
Yes.
Is the rise of the for-profit universities and education, is that affecting people that are in still public schools?
Yes, I'll tell you how. Because with the tax cuts and the corporate loopholes that have been brought in by the corporate-dominated and funded politicians, The money has been taken out of the public school funding. And so right now, would you believe this, that UC system, University of California, is no longer a public school by any definition. They only get less than 40% of their budget from the government. Over 60% comes from private sources, private tuition checks from parents and students, and corporations and endowments. So this is not a public system anymore. So yes, by the politicians giving away our public money from our taxes to these big corporate groups. My book, by the way, has a list of 40 corporations at the back of the book which paid no taxes in 2012 while receiving rebates from the government, corporate welfare. And Facebook leads it. One of the leaders is Facebook. Yes.
Paid no taxes.
Facebook paid no taxes in 2012 while making $1.02 billion in profits.
Is that because their headquarters are...
No, it's actually called the stock option loophole. It's because they could write off all the stock options they gave to their employees as untaxable and legally. And the government allows this because of the law that they wrote. And furthermore, Facebook received $429 million in subsidies from the government. Our money, Mitch, that could have been used for my students to get scholarships or to reduce the tuition levels. Look at countries like Germany. They are not only providing tuition-free education for their own students all the way through medical school and technical school, but they are actually providing about 90 programs, bachelor's degrees, for any student that speaks English. Any international student that goes to Germany and qualifies can then get tuition-free education in Germany for bachelor's degrees and even graduate programs. Other countries in the world, especially in Western Europe and Northern Europe, provide totally universal education. And to me, it goes back to the question of the point that education is a human right, not a privilege, because it helps us develop our full human self if we use it well.
Again, we are in conversation with Peter Mathews. Peter Mathews is the author of the book, Dollar Democracy with Liberty and Justice for Some, How to Reclaim the American Dream for All. He provides political analysis and guest hosts at several radio stations, including our very own sister station, KPFK, in Los Angeles. Peter Mathews, you are a political scientist. You've run for Congress yourself during the 1990s.
Yes.
You were the Democratic nominee for a congressional seat in the 38th District in Southern California. A Republican won each of those times. The second time, 98 was close, 42.
45%.
45%.
To 52.
52 to 45%, so respectable. Looking at this year's elections, do you see trends that are interesting to you?
Well, I see that it's getting worse in terms of dollar democracy. In 2012, $6.2 billion was raised and spent in those elections, federal elections, for president and Congress. And today it's on track to go even further higher up. And more people will buy the campaigns of not just the presidency, but the members of Congress. And that's the real problem, Mitch. In my book, I have a list of every member of Congress's phone number, a direct line to Washington, D.C. And I'm urging the public, with a 13-point demand plan in my book, to demand that these guys stop to call them, first of all, call them and email them, but preferably call them and say, you work for us, Mr. Congressperson or Miss Congressperson. We don't work for you. You need to stop taking corporate money for your elections. We know who you are. We're going to go out there and organize voting blocks against you if you take corporate money. Secondly, we want you to close corporate tax loopholes, bring money for universal health care, universal education, and cleaning up our environment, Mitch. Right now, so many countries like China and Germany are way ahead of us in environmental advancement. You know, China became the first country to build 8,000...
Do you think there's enough people, though, in this country to take that message, to have politicians actually change? Now, I believe that you and I may agree on that.
Yeah.
People listening to this radio station probably agree with that as well. But we are a very small radio station.
Sure.
That's not leading anything in when it comes to listener ratings, for example. What
a great radio station. I love you guys.
We love it too, and we love our listeners. But my point being is that sounds great, but I'm questioning if there is actually the popular support out there to make that type of campaign successful.
You know, Mitch, there actually is. When I take the surveys in my classes, I show students how, look, we can build these high-tech products that are green and environmentally friendly. For example, solar panels. And this new car that China's coming out with this coming year, that's a solar car. The world's first solar car is being produced in China now, has a range of 50 miles just by sitting in the sun for 4 hours. We could produce those here and create jobs for these students coming out of college, because right now, those kinds of jobs are not here. Germany is exporting some of the major technologies and creating jobs for its people. And China, by the way, in foreign policy, has been pursuing more soft power, which includes providing the high-speed rail, which they built in China, 8,000 miles of track in the last few years. They're taking it to Turkey, and they're giving Turkey a loan of $800 billion to help buy that rail.
But I think most people in this country will hear that and will just gloss over and not really care.
Okay, let's say this. So if those countries can do it for themselves and other countries, what about our own government? Why don't we take back this government from the corporate elites and force them to, without violence? I'm a nonviolent person. I'm a Gandhian. But I believe what Gandhi said, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. We've got to get together and organize. We're doing it on the Internet, too. But we have to go beyond that, Mitch. It has to be demonstrations. By the way, I'm speaking at Occupy tonight, Occupy San Francisco, and I must give Occupy, as I do in my book, great credence for bringing up that issue of 1% versus 99%. It's the first time this class consciousness was brought in to show the disparity. And my students know that part. But what is the platform? That's where our 13-point plan comes in, and we have people calling members of Congress and saying, we're going to vote you out unless you get this plan in there. And there are several things like public financing, a 28th Amendment that we're demanding, which would eliminate corporate personhood, and that, let's say that money is not speech. The move to amend 28th Amendment, we're supporting that. So the book has solutions, clean money elections like in Maine and Arizona, especially in Maine where it's brought in progressive people, and Maine became the first state to bring in a comprehensive healthcare system about 10 years ago because they were not bought by the corporate interests such as insurance companies. So,
Peter Mathews, before we wrap up, I do want to get your take on what you think the Bernie Sanders campaign represents.
I think Bernie Sanders' campaign is a refreshing, issue-oriented campaign. He's raising issues that Hillary Clinton would have never raised, issues such as the gap between rich and poor, the corporate loopholes. He's come out for public financing, single-payer health care. Now, he's not a perfect person, like none of us is perfect. And we know there's been things in the media about him and some of his shortcomings. But overall, I think it's very important that he's running. I think it's good he's running the Democratic Party and that he's not going to run as an independent. But, I support third parties, by the way. I support the Green Party and what they're doing. I support proportional representation. We need to expand our democracy. But in this case, in this point in history, Bernie needs to run against Hillary and maximize the debate on progressive issues.
Is that what he can accomplish, maximize the debate, be an oppositional figure?
I really think there's a chance that he could win the primary.
You really think so?
Yes, absolutely. The kind of surge in those popular, where he's going and speaking in public, he has 15,000 people. But besides that, the mainstream media can't avoid him. They've actually spoken about his issues. Of course, they call him a socialist, but he can easily defend that. Social Security is socialist. Come on. So is teaching and being a public officer, a police officer. That's socialism, government, public interest. So he has done a good job. I got to meet him 2 months ago, by the way. I gave him a copy of my book, and he took it well. But I think it's a good thing he's doing it. And for the first time, we have a candidate like him who's really viable and getting a lot of coverage, who has a shot at winning this primary. And I've actually been working. I'm not working formally for him, but I'm letting people know about it.
It's fascinating to see the dynamic between his campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement. Last Saturday in Seattle, Black Lives Matter activists disrupted an event that he had another event later on in the night, which 15,000 people showed up for. But during the day, the event was shut down. It's caused a real uproar on social media.
Yes.
The activists are saying that, we're trying to bring to light racism in Seattle, what it looks like in Seattle, amongst progressives, racism within the progressive community, which I actually think has been a real contribution, actually, even if you go back to what happened in Netroots. Then you have others saying, well, wait a minute, Bernie, after what happened in Netroots, Bernie Sanders' campaign has addressed these issues. You see this as a potential stumbling block for him, as something that...
No, I think it's a very good thing. I think it's very healthy because, first of all, it's real. It is true that racism is still alive and rampant in this country. We know how many young black men have been shot and killed and by the police. And so I think what happened with Bernie is good because it's a moment in which we can enlighten. The Black Lives Matter group is enlightening the American people and telling the liberals don't take anything for granted and make this front and center. This issue of racism and classism do overlap, but racism is real. It's not just classism. And so I really think it's a good thing that's happening. Bernie has to address it, but also we should point out that Bernie Sanders was very active in the civil rights movement. He put his life on the line. He was out there campaigning. He went to the South, I believe. He certainly was involved heavily in the movement as a young person in college. And so he's walked his talk in many ways. He did, in fact, get the private-owned utilities in Burlington to be publicly owned when he became mayor. And he's come through with some votes against the Iraq war when Bush wanted to go in. But, it's very interesting that there's pros and cons, and there will be in democracy within the left and everywhere else about a candidate like him.
And it seems to me that this issue between Black Lives Matter and the Bernie Sanders campaign is about more than Bernie Sanders. To me, it seems to be more about
systemic
progressives.
Racism, yes.
Systemic racism and progressives in this country.
Have quite often not looked at it carefully and ignored some of it. So yes, we progressives have to make sure that people know that that's a really important issue. Because if you don't treat human beings in your own country equally, and you have systemic racism that allows African Americans to be turned down for home loans, Mitch, twice as much as white Americans when they go for home loans. African Americans with the same qualification are turned down that much. That is real human rights violation. When African Americans were not allowed to receive the GI Bill, the part of where they could buy a home with the GI Bill, it was kept from African American soldiers. Do you realize that? And that cut back on their wealth accumulation. The inheritance that African American person receives from his parents is far, far less than other Americans. So this is a very important issue.
I mean, it seems to me, I don't mean to get on my soapbox here, but it's been such a hot issue, especially on social media these past couple of days, that if you want Black Lives Matter oriented folks to be behind working against money in politics, to be behind, better education, against war, all these progressive issues, the environment, obviously, then they must feel like they have an equal voice at the table.
Absolutely correct.
And until that happens.
That has to happen first and foremost, not just for them, but for all of us. And that's where some of our progressives and liberals have been a little weak on that at times. And I'm glad they're pointing it out and helping us clean our own house in that sense.
Peter Mathews, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Mitch. Take care.
Peter Mathews has been our guest. He's a professor of political science at Cypress College and an adjunct professor of sociology at Long Beach City College. He's the author of the book, Dollar Democracy with Liberty and Justice for Some, How to Reclaim the American Dream for All. For our listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area, Peter Mathews will be speaking tonight in San Francisco at the Global Exchange Office, 2017 Mission Street. That's just off 16th Street. It will be on the second floor. Again, that's 2017 Mission Street on the second floor. Peter, what time is that at?
That is 7 o'clock tonight.
7 p.m. tonight. Peter Mathews, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Appreciate it.